The sound of silver striking porcelain cut through the evening ambiance of the crystal room like a gunshot. Conversations stuttered to silence. Crystal glasses froze midway to parted lips. All eyes turned to table 7. Robert Blackwood stood tall above the white tablecloth, his 6'2" frame casting a long shadow across the immaculate table setting. His steel-gray hair caught the amber light from the chandeliers, creating a halo effect that belied the cold fury in his eyes. The sea bass on his plate lay in disarray, the asparagus spears scattered like fallen soldiers. "Unacceptable," he said, his voice dangerously soft, yet somehow filling every corner of the restaurant. Sophie Parker stood before him, 22 years old, and suddenly feeling like she was 12. Her serving tray pressed against her chest like a shield, her knuckles white against the black lacquer. The weight of 40 pairs of eyes pressed down on her shoulders. "I specifically requested the asparagus blanched, not boiled to submission. It's elementary culinary knowledge." His Tom Ford suit jacket remained perfectly buttoned despite his agitation. The Patek Philippe watch on his wrist caught the light as he gestured dismissively at the plate. CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, his face regularly graced the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. His net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations. Sophie swallowed hard, willing her voice not to tremble. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood. I can have the chef prepare a new dish immediately." Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her uniform pressed but showing signs of wear at the cuffs. The contrast between them could not have been more stark. "Don't bother." Robert folded his napkin with precise movements. "The moment is ruined." Michael Thompson, the restaurant manager, appeared at Sophie's side, his forehead glistening with sweat. "Mr. Blackwood, please accept our sincere apologies. Your meal is on the house tonight." Robert ignored him, his cold blue eyes fixed on Sophie. An establishment of this caliber should employ staff with attention to detail. It's indicative of a deeper rot. The word struck Sophie harder than any physical blow. Deeper rot. He wasn't critiquing her service, he was judging her worth. As Robert turned to leave, his leather wallet slipped from his inner jacket pocket, falling open on the polished hardwood floor. Sophie instinctively bent to retrieve it, but Robert swooped down with surprising agility, snatching it from the floor. In that brief moment, a small photograph fluttered out, landing face up at Sophie's feet. The image showed a young woman with luminous eyes and a cascade of dark curls. She was laughing at something beyond the frame, her joy unrestrained and infectious. Around her neck hung a silver locket shaped like a heart. Sophie's breath caught. Her hand instinctively flew to her throat where an identical tarnished silver locket rested beneath her uniform collar. A family heirloom, her mother had said. The only thing she had left of her father. Robert's eyes followed her movement, narrowing slightly as he noticed the chain around her neck. He retrieved the photo with stiff fingers, sliding it back into his wallet without comment. Without another word, he strode from the restaurant, the sharp tap of his Italian leather shoes fading into silence. Sophie stood rooted to the spot, her world tilting on its axis. Outside, Robert slid into the back seat of his waiting Mercedes S-Class. "Home," he instructed his driver curtly, loosening his tie with an uncharacteristically unsteady hand. Sophie took the subway back to the Bronx that night, the image of the woman's face burned into her memory. The stark contrast between their worlds extended far beyond the restaurant. While Robert's driver navigated the sleek vehicle through Manhattan's grid of lights, Sophie stood swaying in the crowded subway car, her aching feet a reminder of the 8-hour shift she had just completed. Robert's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a gleaming skyscraper on the Upper East Side, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city he seemed to possess. Sophie's apartment was a 2-bedroom walk-up in the Bronx, the wallpaper peeling in the corners, the windows offering views of the brick wall of the adjacent building. The elevator whisked Robert upward in seamless silence. Sophie climbed 5 flights of stairs, the banister wobbling slightly under her grip. She unlocked 3 separate locks before pushing open the door to find her grandmother Margaret sitting in her usual armchair, knitting needles clicking steadily in her gnarled hands. At 75, Margaret Parker's body might be failing, but her mind remained sharp as her needles. "You're late, sunshine," Margaret observed without looking up from her work. "Bad night." Sophie hung her coat on the rack by the door, her movements weary. The usual, entitled rich people being entitled. The apartment was small but meticulously clean. What it lacked in space and luxury it made up for in warmth. The walls were covered with Sophie's paintings and sketches, transforming the modest space into a gallery of talent and potential. "Someone special make an appearance tonight?" Margaret asked, her keen eyes missing nothing. Sophie paused the encounter with Robert Blackwood replaying in her mind. Just some CEO with more money than manners. She moved to her grandmother's side, gently checking the oxygen tank beside the armchair. Margaret's heart condition had worsened over the past year, the medical bills piling up faster than Sophie could manage on her waitress salary and occasional art commission. "Did you take your medication?" Sophie asked, examining the pill organizer. Margaret waved away her concern. "Stop fussing. Tell me about your day. Any progress on the Thompson Commission?" Sophie sank into the worn sofa, kicking off her shoes with a grateful sigh. "Almost done. Their anniversary portrait should be ready by next week." What Sophie didn't mention was how her hands had trembled on the subway ride home, not from exhaustion or humiliation, but from the shock of recognition. The woman in the photograph had her eyes, the same shape, the same unusual hazel with flecks of gold, in the locket. Later that night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Sophie retreated to her tiny studio space in what once might have been a walk-in closet. A small window provided minimal ventilation as she worked on her paintings. An easel stood in the center of the space, surrounded by jars of brushes and tubes of paint organized with meticulous care. She closed the door quietly and pulled the chain of her locket, opening the heart-shaped pendant. Inside was half a photograph worn and faded with age. It showed a man's partial profile, the rest torn away, and a portion of the same woman from Robert's photo, their heads tilted toward each other in unmistakable intimacy. Sophie had always assumed the man was her father, though her mother had rarely spoken of him. Catherine Parker had raised Sophie alone, working multiple jobs to provide for her daughter while pursuing a degree in accounting. "He wasn't ready for a family," was all Catherine would say when pressed about Sophie's father. Sometimes people choose different paths. Catherine had passed away 5 years ago after a brief, brutal battle with cancer, leaving Sophie with more questions than answers and the responsibility of caring for Margaret. Sophie placed her locket beside her sketchpad and began to draw from memory the woman in Robert's photograph. Her hand moved with confident strokes, capturing not just the likeness, but the essence of joy in the woman's expression. Hours passed as Sophie lost herself in the work, adding details and shading until the portrait seemed almost alive on the page. It was her gift, this ability to see beyond surfaces to the soul beneath. Her art teachers had recognized it early, encouraging her to pursue formal training. But life had intervened, as it often did with Catherine's illness, and then the mounting medical bills for Margaret. Sophie's dreams of art school had been indefinitely deferred. The digital alarm clock on her desk read 2:17 a.m. when she finally set down her pencil. The portrait was complete, the woman's eyes gazing back at her with uncanny familiarity. Sophie opened her laptop, the ancient machine whirring protestingly to life, and typed Robert Blackwood into the search engine. Countless results appeared instantly. Business articles, Forbes profiles, financial analyses. Robert Blackwood, 50 years old, CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, one of the most successful technology firms in the country. Estimated net worth $3.7 billion. Known for his ruthless business acumen and reclusive personal life. Divorced once, no children. No children. Sophie stared at the words, a strange hollowness opening in her chest. One photograph showed Robert shaking hands with another distinguished-looking businessman. Blackwood Enterprises and Harrington Global announced merger talks. Read the caption. Industry titans Robert Blackwood and James Harrington set to create largest technology consortium in the market. Sophie closed the laptop, her mind racing with possibilities too fantastical to voice even to herself. She needed more information before jumping to conclusions that would upend her understanding of her own history. Sleep eluded her that night, her dreams when they came filled with silver lockets and torn photographs trying desperately to make themselves whole. Across the city, Robert Blackwood stood at the window of his penthouse, a crystal tumbler of 30-year-old scotch untouched in his hand. The city sprawled before him, a tapestry of lights and shadows, all of it seemingly at his command. The penthouse was immaculate, decorated in masculine tones of charcoal and navy original artwork by renowned artists adorning the walls. A Picasso hung casually beside a Rothko, their combined worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Yet for all its opulence, the space felt empty, unlived in. No photographs adorned the surfaces. No evidence of human connection or personal history interrupted the curated perfection. Robert set down his untouched drink and moved to the bedroom. He opened the wall safe hidden behind a sliding panel, keying in the combination from memory. Inside, alongside documents and jewelry of immense value, sat a small velvet box. He removed it with careful hands, opening it to reveal a silver locket identical to the one Sophie wore. He turned it over in his palm, the weight of it heavy with more than just silver. Opening it revealed the other half of the photograph in Sophie's locket. A younger Robert, his face unlined, his eyes warmer, his arm around the shoulders of Catherine Parker. 22 years, he whispered to the empty room. She would be 22 years old now. His phone rang, shattering the moment. He slipped the locket back into the safe before answering. Blackwood, he answered, his voice resuming its usual authoritative tone. Sir, it's William Pierce returning your call. Pierce, I need your services on a personal matter. Discretion is paramount. Of course, Mr. Blackwood. What do you need? Robert paced the length of the window, Manhattan glittering below him. There's a waitress at the Crystal Room. Young woman, early 20s. Dark hair, hazel eyes. I need everything you can find on her. Her name, background, family history, particularly her mother and her date of birth. May I ask what this concerns, sir? No, you may not. I need this information by tomorrow. That's an extremely tight time frame, Mr. Blackwood. Your fee will reflect the urgency. Good night, Pierce. Robert ended the call and returned to the window, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the city. The man who stared back at him was a stranger to the young man in the locket photograph. That Robert had been hungry but idealistic, ambitious but ethical. Somewhere along the way in the relentless pursuit of success, he had lost sight of the man he had intended to become. The next day, Sophie arrived at the Crystal Room with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. After the previous night's incident, she half expected to find her services terminated. Instead, Michael Thompson pulled her aside before the dinner service. About last night, he began, his expression serious. Sophie straightened her shoulders, preparing for the worst. I understand if you need to let me go. Thompson looked surprised. Let you go, Sophie. You're my best server. I'm not firing you because some billionaire had a temper tantrum over asparagus. Relief flooded through her. Thank you, Michael. I really need this job. I know you do. His expression softened. How's your grandmother doing? The same, good days and bad days. Sophie adjusted her apron strings. The new medication is helping, but the youngst... Thompson nodded in understanding. Well, you don't need to worry about your position here. Men like Blackwood, they build empires by tearing others down. Don't let him be the architect of your day. The dinner service proceeded without incident until midway through the evening. Sophie was attending to a foretop in her section when she felt a shift in the restaurant's atmosphere, a collective intake of breath. She turned to see Robert Blackwood being led to a table in the opposite section. Unlike the previous evening, he wasn't alone. A striking woman accompanied him, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. But it was Robert who captured Sophie's attention. He seemed distracted, his gaze sweeping the restaurant until it landed on her. Something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but a strange, disquieting confusion. Throughout the evening, Sophie felt his gaze returning to her. Each time their eyes met, she saw that same puzzled recognition in his expression. A slight furrowing of his brow, a tightening of his jaw. It was as if he was trying to solve a complex equation. Later, as she passed near his table, she heard fragments of his conversation. The merger terms are more than generous, Robert, the woman was saying. James Harrington is practically giving away controlling interest. James Harrington doesn't give anything away without expecting something in return. Robert replied, his attention clearly elsewhere. What's his angle? Does there have to be an angle? Maybe he's finally ready to bury the hatchet after all these years? The only place James would bury a hatchet is in my back, Robert said, his voice hardening. Have legal review the terms again. There's something we're missing. Sophie moved away before they could notice her eavesdropping, but the mention of Harrington's name stuck with her, recalling the article she'd seen the night before. Near the end of the evening, as Sophie was preparing the bill for one of her tables, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Robert standing there, his expression unreadable. Your name, he said without preamble. What is your full name? Sophie hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Sophie Parker. The color drained from Robert's face. His hand gripped the edge of the service station. Parker, he repeated the word barely audible. And your mother's name? A chill ran down Sophie's spine. Why do you want to know that? Robert seemed to collect himself with visible effort. Forgive me. You remind me of someone I once knew. Before Sophie could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her staring after him in confusion. The next day was Sophie's day off. She spent the morning working on a commission piece, a family portrait for a local businessman. The work was technically proficient, but uninspiring, the kind of commercial art that paid bills but did little to fulfill her creative passion. In the afternoon, she attended her art class at the local community center. Professor Diana Wilson, a retired art teacher who volunteered her time, had taken a special interest in Sophie's development. "Your technique has improved dramatically," Wilson commented, examining Sophie's latest work. "But there's something holding you back in your personal pieces, a reluctance to fully commit to the emotional truth." Sophie considered this as she adjusted her easel. "Maybe I'm just tired." "No." Wilson shook her head. "It's something else. Your portraits capture physical likeness perfectly, but the best portraiture reveals the soul of both subject and artist. You're keeping something in reserve." The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. Sophie had always maintained a certain emotional distance in her work, just as she did in her life. It was safer that way, less messy. "There's a scholarship opportunity I think you should consider." Wilson continued, changing the subject. "The New York Academy of Fine Arts, full tuition for 2 years with a stipend for supplies." Sophie's heart leapt before reality crashed back down. "The application fee alone is probably more than I can afford right now." "There are fee waivers available, and you would need to submit a portfolio." Wilson fixed her with a penetrating stare. "You have the talent, Sophie. The question is whether you have the courage to put yourself fully into your work." The conversation lingered in Sophie's mind as she returned home. Margaret was having one of her good days, sitting at the small kitchen table, sorting through old photographs. "Look what I found," Margaret said as Sophie entered. "Your mother's high school graduation picture." Sophie set down her bag and took the faded photograph. Catherine Parker at 18, her smile bright with promise and possibility. The future still an unwritten page. "She was so beautiful," Sophie said softly. "And smart as a whip," Margaret added. "Could have been anything she wanted." "Then she had me," Sophie said, the old guilt surfacing. Margaret reached across the table to grasp Sophie's hand. "Having you was the best decision she ever made. Don't ever think otherwise." Sophie helped her grandmother prepare a simple dinner, the routine of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, comforting in its normalcy. As they ate, Sophie found herself thinking about the strange encounters with Robert Blackwood. "Grandma, did Mom ever mention where she worked before I was born?" Margaret looked up from her plate, surprise evident in her expression. "She had several jobs." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. I realize there's so much about her life I never thought to ask about while she was here." Margaret set down her fork, her expression thoughtful. "She worked as an accountant for a small tech startup for a while. This would have been before you were born. Blackwood something or other. The founder was a young hotshot with big ideas." Sophie's heart stuttered in her chest. "Blackwood Technologies. That's it? It was just getting off the ground then?" "Nothing like the giant it became." Margaret tilted her head. "Why the sudden interest in your mother's employment history?" Sophie hesitated, uncertain how much to share. "I served Robert Blackwood at the restaurant. He seemed to recognize me, or at least I reminded him of someone." Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sophie caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Concern. Recognition. "The world is full of coincidences, sunshine." But it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like puzzle pieces slowly shifting into place. After dinner, while Margaret watched her evening shows, Sophie retreated to her bedroom. She pulled out the old cardboard box she kept under her bed, the one containing her mother's personal effects. Catherine hadn't left much behind. A few pieces of jewelry, some books, a small collection of photographs, and a journal. Sophie had never read it, feeling it would somehow violate her mother's privacy, even though Catherine was gone. But now, driven by a growing suspicion, she opened the worn leather cover. The entries were sporadic sometimes, months passing between them. Sophie flipped through the pages until she reached an entry dated March 2002. "Rob and I fought again today. The company is growing faster than either of us expected, and he's changing. There's a hardness in him now that wasn't there before. Money and power are reshaping him. I'm not sure I recognize the man I fell in love with anymore." Sophie's breath caught. Robert Blackwood. She turned the page. The investor meeting was a disaster. James Harrington tried to force Rob to sell controlling interest, threatening to pull his funding when we need it most. Rob refused to back down. "I admire his courage, but I fear his ambition will consume him. There must be a balance between success and soul." Sophie continued reading, her heart pounding, as her mother's words painted a picture of a passionate but increasingly troubled relationship. Catherine had clearly loved this man deeply, but had grown concerned about the person he was becoming in pursuit of his business ambitions. The final entry was dated July 2002. I made my decision. I can't watch Rob destroy himself for the sake of success. The company has become his obsession, his identity. I've tried to remind him of who he was when we started, of the values he once held dear, but he can't hear me anymore. And now with the baby coming, I won't raise my child in a world where money matters more than morality. Better no father than one who places profit above people. I leave tomorrow. One day, perhaps, he'll remember the man he wanted to be. The baby. Sophie pressed her hand to her mouth, tears blurring her vision. The timing aligned perfectly with her birth in March 2003, 8 months after this entry. Hands shaking, she continued searching through the box until she found a small envelope she had never noticed before. Inside was a letter addressed but never sent to Robert Blackwood. Rob, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I've tried to reach you so many times, but you've surrounded yourself with walls I can no longer breach. Success has cost you your soul, and I refuse to stand by and watch. There's something you should know. I'm pregnant. Our child deserves a father who remembers that life isn't measured in stock options and market share, but in moments of connection and compassion. When you remember that man, when you find your way back to who you truly are, perhaps you can be part of our child's life. Until then, I release you from any obligation. I will always love the man you were. I hope someday he returns. Catherine. Sophie stared at the letter, her world rearranging itself around this new reality. Robert Blackwood. The billionaire CEO who had humiliated her in a high-end restaurant was her biological father. A man who, according to her mother, had never known she existed. Unless he had figured it out now, the way he looked at her, the questions about her name and her mother, the photograph of Catherine, the matching locket. Across the city, Robert sat alone in his study, the contents of an investigator's file spread across his desk. Sophie Parker, born March 15, 2003, to Catherine Parker. No father listed on the birth certificate. Photographs of Sophie throughout her life. School records showing exceptional artistic talent. Employment history at the Crystal Room in various other service jobs. Medical records indicating her grandmother's heart condition and the mounting medical bills. And most damning of all, proof that Catherine had indeed tried to contact him before leaving New York. Phone records showing multiple calls to his office in July and August 2002, none of which had been passed through to him. A copy of a letter similar to the one Sophie had found intercepted by his then-assistant Linda Coleman, who had been secretly on James Harrington's payroll. A conspiracy of silence and sabotage that had cost him 22 years with his daughter. Robert closed the file, his hand trembling slightly. The face that looked back at him from Sophie's most recent photograph was a perfect blend of Catherine's features and his own. The evidence was irrefutable. He had a daughter, and she had served him asparagus that he had rejected as beneath him. The irony was both painful and fitting. He had become exactly what Catherine had feared, a man so consumed by success he had lost sight of what truly mattered. A man who measured worth by wealth, who judged others by their utility to him. Robert picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. Pierce, I need everything you can find on James Harrington's current activities, particularly anything concerning the Crystal Room restaurant or an art gallery in Soho. May I ask why, sir? Because Harrington has been playing a very long game, and I think he's finally making his move. Robert ended the call and turned to the window. The city lights blurred before him as a single tear tracked down his cheek, the first he had allowed himself in decades. I'm sorry, Kathy, he whispered to the empty room. You were right about everything. The question now was whether it was too late to become the man Catherine had believed he could be, the father Sophie deserved. The Metropolitan Museum of Art bustled with the quiet energy of a Tuesday afternoon. Sophie moved through the European Paintings Gallery, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, seeking the solitude that great art provided. Here, surrounded by masterpieces, she could think clearly about the revelations of the past few days. The truth about her father sat heavy in her chest. Robert Blackwood, billionaire, CEO, a man whose reputation for ruthless business practices was legendary. The man who had humiliated her over asparagus. She settled on a bench before a Rembrandt self-portrait, opening her sketchbook to a fresh page. Drawing had always been her refuge, the place where chaos transformed into order. Her pencil moved across the paper, capturing the play of shadow and light in the master's work. Remarkable technique. The voice behind her sent a jolt down her spine. Sophie turned to find Robert Blackwood studying her sketch over her shoulder. Today he wore no tie, his collar open at the throat, making him seem almost approachable. Almost. You've captured his essence, not just his appearance. Robert gestured toward her drawing. That's extraordinarily difficult. Sophie closed her sketchbook, hard hammering. Are you following me, Mr. Blackwood? A faint smile touched his lips. Contrary to what you might think, the entire world doesn't revolve around my schedule. I have a meeting with the museum's board in an hour. I'm a donor. He hesitated, then added, though I'll admit seeing you wasn't entirely unwelcome. An older couple moved past them, the woman's perfume lingering in the air. Sophie noticed Robert watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, onging regret. I behaved abominably at the restaurant, he said finally. I'd like to apologize. Sophie studied him, searching for sincerity in those cold blue eyes. Is that why you came back the next night to apologize? No, his gaze met hers directly. I came back because something about you seemed familiar. I couldn't place it at first. The unspoken question hung between them. Did he know? Had he figured it out? Sophie's fingers instinctively went to the locket beneath her blouse. I should go, she said, gathering her things. Wait. His voice softened, losing its commanding edge. I'm not very good at this. Personal interactions, I mean. Business is straightforward. People are more complex. Despite herself, Sophie felt a flicker of curiosity. This uncertain version of Robert Blackwood contradicted everything she'd read about the ruthless titan of industry. Maybe people wouldn't be so complex if others didn't judge their worth by how perfectly they blanch asparagus, she said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. To her surprise, Robert laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. Touché, Ms. Parker, I deserve that. A strange moment of connection passed between them, quickly broken by the shrill ring of Sophie's phone. The hospital's number flashed on her screen, sending ice through her veins. I have to take this, she said, moving away for privacy. The news was bad. Margaret had collapsed at home, possible heart attack. She was being rushed to Mount Sinai. Sophie ended the call, her hands trembling as she shoved her phone into her bag. She had to get to the hospital immediately, but it was across town in rush hour traffic. Ms. Parker, is everything all right? She had forgotten Robert was there, watching her with surprising concern. My grandmother. She's had a heart attack. I need to get to Mount Sinai right away. Without hesitation, Robert pulled out his phone. Charles' front entrance now. He pocketed the device and turned to Sophie. My car's downstairs. I'll take you. That's not necessary, Sophie protested weakly. It's not a discussion. Come. Minutes later, Sophie found herself in the back of a Mercedes S-Class, Robert beside her, as his driver navigated skillfully through Manhattan traffic. She sat rigid with worry, staring out the window at the blur of buildings. She raised you, Robert asked quietly. Sophie nodded. After my mother died, 5 years ago, cancer. Robert said, not a question but a statement of fact. Sophie's head snapped toward him. How did you know that? Robert looked away, his jaw tightening. The Crystal Room keeps profiles on its regular customers. I must have seen it mentioned. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But before Sophie could press further, the car pulled up to the emergency entrance of Mount Sinai Hospital. Thank you for the ride, Sophie said stiffly, reaching for the door handle. Wait. Robert reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. If you need anything at all. Sophie stared at the card embossed with the Blackwood Enterprises logo before taking it grudgingly. Then she was out of the car and running through the automatic doors into the sterile fluorescent world of the hospital. Margaret had been stabilized but remained in critical condition. The cardiac surgeon explained that she needed an emergency valve replacement, a complex procedure with significant risks given her age and condition. The surgery is very expensive, the doctor added with practiced neutrality. I understand you don't have premium insurance coverage. How much? Sophie asked, her voice small. When he named the figure, Sophie felt the floor shift beneath her. Even with all her savings, selling everything she owned, taking on more jobs, there was no way she could come up with that kind of money. I'll find a way, she said, more to herself than the doctor. Just please do whatever you need to save her. Hours passed in the cold plastic chair beside Margaret's bed. Sophie watched the rhythmic rise and fall of her grandmother's chest, the only mother she had known for the past 5 years. She couldn't lose her too. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I hope your grandmother is stable. If financial assistance is needed for her care, please don't hesitate to ask. No strings attached. Robert Blackwood. Sophie stared at the message, emotions warring within her. Pride told her to delete it. Practicality argued that her grandmother's life was worth more than pride. And something deeper, something she wasn't ready to examine, wondered what it would mean to accept help from the father who had never been part of her life. She was still contemplating her response when a nurse entered with a tablet in hand. "Ms. Parker, there's been an update to your grandmother's file. It appears all expenses for her care have been covered by the hospital's Compassionate Care Fund." Sophie frowned. "What's that?" "A fund for patients with financial need. It's unusual for approval to happen this quickly, but apparently your case was expedited." Sophie wasn't naive. She knew exactly who was behind this. But before she could question further, another message appeared on her phone. "Before you object, I sit on the hospital's board. The fund is legitimate and helps many patients. Your grandmother qualified. That's all." She slipped the phone back into her pocket without responding, her emotions too tangled to unravel. Her grandmother would get the care she needed. That was what mattered right now. As evening fell, Sophie stepped out of the hospital for fresh air, the day's events swirling in her mind. Her father had entered her life in the most unexpected way, and now he was inserting himself further, paying for Margaret's care. What did he want? What did she want? Sophie Parker. She turned to find a distinguished man in his mid-50s approaching, silver hair, perfectly styled, his Italian suit impeccable, even at this late hour. Something about him radiated charm and danger in equal measure. "James Harrington," he introduced himself with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." Sophie recognized this name immediately from her mother's journal and the news articles about the pending merger. "How do you know who I am?" she asked cautiously. Harrington's smile never wavered. "I make it my business to know talented young artists. I saw your work at the community exhibition last month. Extraordinary emotional intelligence in your brushwork." It was a precise compliment, one that suggested he genuinely understood art. Sophie found herself intrigued despite her wariness. "Thank you, but this isn't a great time. My grandmother is ill." "Yes, I heard. I'm very sorry." His expression shifted to appropriate concern. "Actually, that's partly why I'm here. I understand medical care can be financially devastating for young people trying to build careers." Sophie tensed. "The hospital's taking care of it." "Ah, Robert Blackwood's doing, I presume." Harrington nodded knowingly. He always did have a talent for grand gestures when it suited his purposes. The implication wasn't lost on Sophie. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Harrington glanced around the hospital entrance. "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more comfortable. My car is just across the street." Every instinct told Sophie to decline, yet curiosity propelled her forward. This man had history with Robert, history that might help her understand the father she'd never known. Harrington's Bentley made Robert's Mercedes seem almost modest. The interior was buttery soft leather in deep burgundy, the privacy partition raised as the driver navigated smoothly into traffic. "I've been following your work for some time," Harrington said, offering Sophie a bottle of water from the car's refrigerator. "You have a rare gift for portraiture, the ability to reveal character through expression." "Thank you," Sophie replied cautiously, "but I doubt you brought me into your car to discuss my artistic technique." Harrington's laugh was genuine. "Direct, I appreciate that." He reached into a briefcase and withdrew a glossy brochure. "I own a gallery in Soho, the Harrington Gallery. Perhaps you've heard of it." Sophie had more than heard of it. The Harrington Gallery was one of the most prestigious contemporary art spaces in New York, a kingmaker in the art world. Getting a showing there was the dream of every aspiring artist. "I'm considering hosting an exhibition of emerging portrait artists," Harrington continued. "Your work would be the centerpiece." Sophie's heart raced at the opportunity even as suspicion clouded her thoughts. "Why me? There are countless talented artists in New York." "True, but few with your particular perspective." Harrington's eyes gleamed in the dim light of the car's interior. "I understand you recently discovered some interesting family connections." The air in the car suddenly felt thin. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Come now, Sophie. The resemblance is striking once one knows to look for it. Same eyes, same determination in the jaw." Harrington leaned forward slightly. "Robert Blackwood is your father." The words hung in the air between them. Sophie neither confirmed nor denied, but her silence was answer enough. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. "Longer than Robert has, I suspect." Harrington sat back, studying her reaction. "Your mother worked for Blackwood Technologies in its early days. She and Robert were quite the item until she abruptly left the company. 9 months later, you were born." Sophie's mind raced. "What do you want from me?" "To offer you an opportunity. The exhibition I mentioned. A chance to tell your story, your truth through your art." The talented daughter Robert Blackwood never knew existed, making her way despite his absence. The car pulled up outside a sleek building in Soho. Harrington led Sophie inside the Harrington Gallery, the space currently closed to the public. The gallery was everything an artist could dream of: white walls soaring to high ceilings, perfect lighting, the hush of a sacred space devoted to creativity. "Imagine your work here," Harrington said, gesturing to the main exhibition wall. "A series of portraits exploring identity, family, abandonment, discovery. Your technical skill combined with the emotional power of your personal narrative." Sophie could see it, her paintings illuminated by perfect gallery lighting, critics and collectors gathering to view her work. The opportunity was intoxicating. "And what do you get out of this?" she asked, forcing herself to look away from the tantalizing vision. Harrington's smile never reached his eyes. "Let's just say I have a long-standing interest in Robert Blackwood's life story. The public deserves to know the man behind the corporate facade. You want to use me to get to him. I want to give you a platform for your talent and your truth." He walked to a small bar in the corner of the gallery, pouring himself a mineral water. The fact that it might discomfort Robert is merely a pleasant side effect. He handed Sophie a folder containing a contract: full exhibition, promotion in major art publications, a scholarship to the New York Academy of Fine Arts, plus a stipend generous enough to ensure you never have to serve asparagus to entitled billionaires again. The package was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, a life-changing opportunity that artists twice her age would kill for. "All you need to do is tell your story through your art and participate in a few interviews about your journey and your newfound father." "You must hate him very much," Sophie observed. Harrington's pleasant expression hardened momentarily. "Robert and I have history. He built his empire on the back of my innovations. He stole more than just technology from me." Before Sophie could question him further, her phone rang. The hospital. Margaret's condition had deteriorated. She needed to return immediately. "I have to go," she said, clutching the contract folder unconsciously. "Of course. Family comes first." Harrington walked her to the door. "Consider my offer, Sophie. This is your chance to control your own narrative, to ensure your grandmother gets the best care possible, to secure your future as an artist." He handed her his card. "The exhibition is scheduled for next month. I'll need your answer within the week." The ride back to the hospital passed in a blur of conflicted thoughts. When Sophie arrived, the cardiac surgeon was waiting with grave news. Margaret needed an experimental procedure available only at a private clinic, one that her current coverage certainly wouldn't approve. "How much?" Sophie asked for the second time that day. The figure the doctor quoted made the previous amount seem trivial by comparison. "I understand this is overwhelming," the surgeon said kindly. "There are sometimes other options, clinical trials." "Do it," Sophie interrupted. "Whatever she needs. I'll figure out the money." Later, alone in the hospital cafeteria, Sophie stared at two business cards side by side on the scratched Formica table. Robert Blackwood, James Harrington. Two titans of industry suddenly intersecting with her previously anonymous life. One, her biological father, offering help with no apparent agenda. The other, offering everything she'd ever dreamed of, with the clear agenda of using her against her newfound father. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to the number Robert had used earlier. "We need to talk, not at your office or any restaurant, somewhere normal." His response came almost immediately. "Central Park, Bethesda Fountain, tomorrow at 10 a.m. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, autumn painting Central Park in golds and reds. Sophie arrived early, watching tourists snap photos of the famous Angel of the Water statue. She'd come here often to sketch, finding endless inspiration in the diverse faces and interactions. Robert arrived exactly at 10, dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him, in dark jeans and a cashmere sweater. Without the armor of his business suit, he seemed almost human. He bought them both coffee from a nearby vendor, handing Sophie hers without asking how she took it. "Black with 1 sugar." "Exactly right." "Your grandmother?" he asked as they began walking along the path circling the lake. "Stable for now. They're transferring her to a specialized cardiac unit." Sophie took a sip of her coffee. "Thank you for the hospital fund." Robert nodded, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "It's the least I could do." "Why?" He looked at her, then really looked at her, his eyes softening. "Because she raised you when I didn't, when I couldn't." The simple acknowledgement hung between them. Neither had explicitly stated what they both knew, but with those words, Robert had confirmed it. "Did you know?" Sophie asked the question that had tormented her since discovering her mother's unsent letter. "About me. Did you know I existed?" Robert stopped, walking, turning to face the lake. For a long moment, he was silent, the muscle in his jaw working. "No," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother left without telling me she was pregnant. By the time I—" He hesitated. "By the time I tried to find her, she had disappeared. Changed her name, perhaps. I searched, but not hard enough, not long enough." "She tried to contact you," Sophie said, after she left. Robert's head snapped toward her. "What?" "I found an unsent letter in her things. She wrote that she tried to reach you several times but never got through." Robert closed his eyes briefly, pain etching lines into his face. "Linda Coleman," he said almost to himself. "My assistant at the time. She intercepted Catherine's calls and letters. She was working for Harrington, feeding him information about our operations." "James Harrington. You know him?" Robert's voice sharpened. Sophie hesitated, then told him about her encounter with Harrington the previous evening. The gallery offer, the exhibition, the interviews, the clear intention to use her story against Robert. As she spoke, she watched Robert's expression harden, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the mask of the businessman. "Harrington has spent 25 years trying to destroy me," Robert said when she finished. "This is just his latest attempt. Why does he hate you so much?" Robert laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "The official story is that I stole his technology and built Blackwood Enterprises on his intellectual property. The reality is more complicated." "I need to know," Sophie pressed. "If I'm going to be used as a pawn in your corporate war, I deserve to know why." Robert nodded, acknowledging the fairness of her demand. They found a bench overlooking the lake and sat watching a pair of swans glide across the water's surface. "James Harrington and I were partners once, back when Blackwood Technologies was just 3 people in a garage," Robert began. "James had the technical brilliance. I had the business acumen and the vision for how to apply his innovations." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "We were close friends, brothers almost. Then Catherine came to work for us as our accountant." Sophie could see where this was heading. They were involved. "Briefly before she and I—" Robert cleared his throat. "James never forgave me. He claimed I stole her, just like he later claimed I stole his technology." "Did you steal his technology?" Robert met her gaze directly. "No, I improved upon it, transformed it into something marketable, something useful. James was brilliant but impractical. He wanted technical perfection, regardless of cost or commercial viability. So you took his ideas and made them profitable." "I took concepts we developed together and built a company around them." "Yes." Robert's expression hardened. "The courts agreed with me in 3 separate lawsuits." They sat in silence for a moment, Sophie processing this information. "There's more to it than business rivalry," she said finally. "He seemed to hate you on a personal level." Robert sighed deeply. "After your mother left, I was not in a good place. I threw myself into work, became ruthless, driven. When our next product launch faced delays, I suspected internal sabotage. It turned out to be James attempting to destroy the company from within." "What did you do?" "What I had to." Robert's voice turned cold. "I gathered evidence, confronted him, and forced him out without a penny of his investment. I made sure no reputable tech company would touch him for years." "You ruined him." "I protected what I built." Robert's eyes flashed. "What your mother and I built together. After she left the company was all I had left of her, of us. I couldn't let Harrington destroy that too." Sophie absorbed this, trying to reconcile the cold businessman beside her with the passionate young entrepreneur her mother had loved. "Now," Robert continued, "Harrington's company has developed encryption technology that would integrate perfectly with our security systems. A merger would benefit both companies enormously. But I never trusted his sudden willingness to bury the hatchet. Now I know why." His gaze locked with hers. "He found you, his perfect revenge." The weight of this realization settled heavily on Sophie's shoulders. She was caught between 2 powerful men with decades of enmity between them. One her biological father, the other offering her dream career. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "That depends on you." Robert's voice was carefully neutral. "Harrington's offer is genuine, I'm sure. He can make your career overnight. All you have to do is publicly denounce the father you never knew." The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. "I haven't decided yet," Sophie admitted. "Grandmother needs specialized care I can't possibly afford. This opportunity with Harrington could change everything for us." "I can pay for any medical care she needs," Robert countered immediately. "You don't need Harrington's money." Sophie felt a flash of anger. "So I should trade one wealthy man's agenda for another's, accept your money instead of his? What's the difference?" "The difference is I'm your father." The words exploded from him, echoing slightly across the water before falling into stunned silence. It was the first time either of them had said it aloud. Father. The word hung between them, enormous and inadequate all at once. A father I met 2 weeks ago, Sophie said quietly. A father who doesn't know the first thing about me. Robert's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. You're right, I have no claim on you. No right to ask anything of you. He stood, hands in his pockets. Whatever you decide about Harrington's offer, I'll respect it. And the offer of help for your grandmother stands regardless. He turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, you have your mother's talent and her integrity. She would be proud of the woman you've become, even without my influence. Sophie watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing among the trees and joggers of the park. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire CEO, but a man marked by loss and regret, trying in his own flawed way to make amends. Her phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. Margaret was awake and asking for her. Sophie gathered her things, her decision still unmade, the weight of two possible futures pressing against her chest. At the hospital, Sophie found Margaret looking frail but alert, her keen eyes immediately noting her granddaughter's troubled expression. Out with it, Margaret said without preamble. Whatever's eating at you. Sophie sank into the chair beside the bed. It's complicated. Life usually is, try me. Sophie hesitated, then began at the beginning. The incident at the restaurant, the photograph, the locket, the discovery of Robert Blackwood as her father, Harrington's offer, and the choice before her. Margaret listened without interruption, her weathered face revealing nothing until Sophie finished. Your mother never wanted you to know, Margaret said finally. She believed Robert had become someone she couldn't recognize, someone consumed by ambition and success at any cost. Is that why she left him? Sophie asked. Margaret nodded slowly. Partly, but there was more to it. Catherine saw what wealth and power were doing to the man she loved. How it changed him, hardened him. She didn't want that for you. But she kept the locket. Sophie touched the silver chain around her neck. She never completely let go. No, she didn't. Margaret reached for Sophie's hand. Catherine loved Robert deeply. That's why his transformation hurt her so much. She always hoped he would find his way back to the man he'd been. And now he wants to be part of my life. After 22 years of absence. Absence he didn't choose, Sophie reminded her. Mom never told him about me. Margaret's eyes grew distant with memory. Your mother made the best decision she could with the information she had. She believed she was protecting you. From what money opportunities a father, from becoming something other than who you were meant to be. Margaret squeezed Sophie's hand. Look at the man who humiliated you over asparagus, Sophie. Is that who you want shaping your values, your understanding of the world? Sophie couldn't answer. The Robert who had emotionally eviscerated her at the restaurant seemed worlds away from the vulnerable man in the park this morning. And this Harrington fellow, Margaret continued, he's no better, using you to settle an old score. These men play games with people's lives. They always have. So what do I do? Sophie asked, feeling suddenly very young and lost. Harrington's offer could change everything for us, for my art, for your medical care. Margaret's expression softened. Your mother ran away from Robert's world not to give you an easy life, Sophie, but to give you an honest one, a life where your heart and hands work together. She patted Sophie's cheek gently. This man Harrington is asking you to tell a beautiful lie. He wants to use your truth to serve his own greed. Sophie felt tears prickling behind her eyes. I don't know what to do. Wealth is like the tide, my dear. It can be a gentle one that lifts all boats, or it can be a tsunami that washes a person clean away from who they are. Margaret's eyes were clear and direct. Do not let that tide wash you away. Sophie felt something settling in her chest, a clarity she hadn't possessed before. Her grandmother hadn't told her what to do, but she had reminded her of who she was and where she came from. That night, sitting in the hospital corridor while Margaret slept, Sophie made her call. Mr. Harrington, it's Sophie Parker. Sophie, I was just thinking about you. We can have the contracts drawn up by tomorrow morning if you're ready to move forward. Sophie took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing with each word. I'm not interested, Mr. Harrington. The silence on the other end was immediate and cold. When Harrington spoke again, the charm had evaporated from his voice. I don't think I heard you correctly. You heard me perfectly, she said, her voice steady and clear. My story isn't for sale. My art isn't a weapon in your vendetta. And my dreams aren't for sale either, it turns out. Not at that price. You're a fool, Harrington hissed, his true nature revealing itself in the venom of his tone. You're choosing him, the man who forgot you existed, You'll be a waitress for the rest of your life, dreaming of what you threw away. No, Sophie said, a sad smile touching her lips. I'm not choosing him. I'm choosing me. You weren't offering me the world. You were offering me a cage. It was just a prettier one than I'm used to. Goodbye, Mr. Harrington. She ended the call feeling a profound sense of release, as if she had shed a heavy, suffocating skin. Her next call was to Robert. Can we meet? She asked. Not at your office or some fancy restaurant, somewhere real. The decision had been made, but the journey was just beginning. Sophie had declined Harrington's poison chalice, but what came next between her and the father she was only beginning to know remained as unformed as a blank canvas, awaiting the first stroke of paint. Central Park wore autumn like a bespoke suit, every tree draped in crimson and gold, the morning light filtering through leaves to create patterns on the path like stained glass. Robert Blackwood sat on a bench overlooking the reservoir, the skyline of his city rising behind him in a testament to human ambition and engineering. For the first time in decades, he had arrived early to a meeting. Punctuality had always been one of his non-negotiable business principles, but today he had come 30 minutes before the appointed time, watching joggers circle the water, feeling strangely vulnerable without his executive armor. He caught his reflection in the still water of the reservoir. The face that looked back at him belonged to a stranger, a man worn by time and success and solitude. When had his hair become more salt than pepper? When had those lines around his eyes deepened from temporary expressions into permanent fixtures? Robert checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The Patek Philippe had been a gift to himself when Blackwood Enterprises went public, a personal tradition of marking major life events with significant timepieces. His collection now numbered dozens, each commemorating triumphs that suddenly seemed hollow. He spotted Sophie approaching from the east path. Even at a distance, he could see Catherine in her walk, a certain grace that was both effortless and determined. His heart performed a complicated maneuver in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced since the early days with Catherine, when the future stretched before them unmarked and full of possibility. Sophie wore jeans and a simple blue sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. No designer labels, no artificial enhancement. In a city where appearance was currency, her naturalness was both striking and familiar. Catherine had been the same, beautiful without effort or pretense. Thank you for coming, Robert said as she reached the bench. Sophie sat beside him, leaving careful space between them. I appreciate you meeting me here. I needed neutral ground. The phrase struck Robert as both pointed and accurate. They were in many ways negotiating a treaty between two nations with a complex history, searching for terms that might allow for peaceful coexistence. I turned down Harrington's offer, Sophie said without preamble. Robert nodded, keeping his expression neutral, despite the relief washing through him. May I ask why? It wasn't about you, she said, her gaze fixed on the water. Or not mainly about you. It was about me, about the kind of artist I want to be, the kind of person I want to be. And what kind is that? Sophie turned to face him fully. The kind who doesn't use her art as a weapon. The kind who doesn't sell her story to the highest bidder. Pride swelled in Robert's chest, unexpected and powerful. That's a decision Catherine would have made. I know. She did make it once, according to her journals. She refused money from a competitor who wanted inside information about your early products. Robert's throat tightened at the memory. James Harrington, the same man who approached you. History does have a way of repeating itself. He told me you stole his technology, that you built your empire on his innovations. And you want to know if it's true. Sophie nodded. I need to understand what I've walked into, what kind of man my father is. Father, the word still felt foreign on the air between them, both a title and an accusation. Robert had earned many titles in his life, CEO, founder, billionaire, philanthropist. But father was one he had never expected to claim, especially not with a grown daughter who had already formed her values and perspectives without his influence. The full truth is complicated and not entirely flattering to either of us, Robert admitted. Harrington was brilliant, no question, a technical genius, but he was also rigid, uncompromising, and utterly uninterested in commercial applications. Robert paused, organizing his thoughts. I took his technical innovations and made them practical, marketable. I built the business infrastructure that turned ideas into products. In his mind, that was theft. In mine, it was transformation. And the courts agreed with you, Sophie said, recalling their earlier conversation. They did. 3 times. Robert's expression hardened momentarily. But Harrington never accepted the verdicts. For 25 years, he's been looking for ways to destroy what I built. And now he's using me. Trying to, Robert corrected gently. You've made that impossible by refusing his offer. Sophie looked away, vulnerability crossing her features. He won't give up. He was furious when I called to decline. Said I'd be a waitress all my life, dreaming of what I threw away. Anger flared hot in Robert's chest. Harrington always did lash out when thwarted. I'm not afraid of him, Sophie said, her chin lifting in a gesture so reminiscent of Catherine that Robert felt his heart constrict. But I am concerned about grandmother. Her medical care is expensive, and without Harrington's money— I told you I would cover all her expenses, Robert interjected. Sophie's expression cooled. And I'm still not comfortable with that. Because you don't trust me, or because you don't want to be obligated to me. Both. Neither. Sophie ran a hand through her hair in frustration. I've been independent all my life, taking care of myself and grandmother since Mom died. Accepting help feels like failure. Robert considered this. Catherine was the same way, fiercely independent. It was one of the qualities I most admired in her. He paused. And one of the reasons she left, I think. She saw my success changing me, making me someone who believed money could solve any problem. Can it? Sophie asked with a hint of challenge. Robert laughed softly. It solves some problems and creates entirely new ones. Money is a tool, nothing more. Like any tool, its value depends on how you use it. They sat in contemplative silence, watching a pair of swans glide across the water's surface, the image of serenity hiding the furious paddling beneath. Tell me about her, Robert said finally. Catherine, the years I missed. Sophie's expression softened. She was incredible, strong but gentle. She worked so hard, put herself through school while raising me, never complained. She could make me laugh even on her worst days. Her voice caught slightly. She painted too. Not professionally, but she was talented. That's where I get it from. From both of us, perhaps, Robert said quietly. I used to sketch architectural designs when we were starting out. Buildings I dreamed of constructing someday. Sophie looked surprised. You never built them? No. Other dreams took precedence. The admission carried the weight of choices made and paths not taken. Catherine always said I had an artist's eye trapped in a businessman's mind. She never spoke badly of you, Sophie offered unexpectedly. When I asked about my father, she would say only that you weren't ready for a family, that you had chosen a different path. No bitterness, no accusations. Robert swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. She was a better person than I deserved. She kept your photograph in her locket. Sophie touched the silver pendant around her neck. Even after everything. Robert reached inside his shirt collar and withdrew a matching silver locket. So did I. Sophie stared at the matching piece, her eyes widening. You wore it all this time. Every day since she left. Robert opened the locket to reveal the other half of the torn photograph. It was my reminder of what I had lost by choosing ambition over love. In a gesture that surprised them both, Sophie reached for her own locket, removing it from her neck. She opened it and held it beside Robert's, the two halves of the photograph aligning perfectly to form a complete image. Catherine and Robert, young and in love, their faces filled with hope for a future they would never share. We should have been a family, Robert said, his voice rough with emotion. The three of us. Sophie nodded, unable to speak, as the weight of what might have been settled over them. 22 years of moments lost, never to be recovered. First steps, birthdays, school plays, graduations, the mundane miracles of everyday life that accumulate to form the foundation of family bonds. I can't change the past, Robert said finally. I can't reclaim those years or be the father you needed then. But I'm here now if you'll allow me some place in your life. Sophie returned her locket to its place around her neck, the familiar weight settling against her collarbone. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how to have a father after all this time. Neither do I, Robert admitted with unexpected humility. But perhaps we could learn together. Before Sophie could respond, her phone rang. The hospital again, creating a sense of déjà vu that sent ice through her veins. Parker, she answered tensely. Robert watched the color drain from her face as she listened, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. I'll be right there, she said, ending the call and standing abruptly. What's happened? Robert asked, rising beside her. Grandmother's had a setback. They're rushing her into emergency surgery. Sophie's voice was tight with controlled panic. I need to get to the hospital. Without hesitation, Robert pulled out his phone. My driver is waiting at the west entrance. He'll get you there faster than a taxi. This time, Sophie didn't protest the offer of help. Thank you. I'm coming with you, Robert said, falling into step beside her as they hurried along the park path. Sophie glanced at him in surprise but didn't object. Together, they moved with purpose toward the waiting car, the first collaborative act of their newly acknowledged connection. At Mount Sinai, Sophie rushed to the surgical floor, Robert following at a respectful distance. Dr. Adams, the cardiac specialist, was waiting with grave news. The valve replacement we performed has failed, he explained. We need to operate again immediately. It's a complex procedure with significant risk, but without it, he left the sentence unfinished, its conclusion obvious. Do whatever you need to save her, Sophie said firmly. As Dr. Adams departed to prepare for surgery, Sophie sank into a waiting room chair, the reality of potentially losing her last family member crushing down upon her. Robert sat beside her, carefully maintaining the space between them. Is there anything I can do? Sophie shook her head, then reconsidered. Actually, yes. Could you find the chapel? I need a few minutes alone. Understanding her need for private space to process her emotions, Robert nodded and stood. Of course, I'll be nearby if you need anything. As he walked away, Sophie felt a mixture of gratitude and confusion. This considerate, supportive man seemed worlds away from the cold executive who had humiliated her at the Crystal Room. Hours passed in the sterile purgatory of the hospital waiting room. Sophie alternated between pacing and sitting rigidly in uncomfortable chairs, her hands fidgeting with her locket. Robert remained present but unobtrusive, arranging for food. She didn't eat coffee, she barely tasted, and fielding business calls with uncharacteristic brevity. You don't have to stay, Sophie said as afternoon faded toward evening. This could be a long night. I know, Robert replied simply. I'm staying anyway. The simple declaration, offered without expectation of gratitude or recognition, touched something deep in Sophie's chest. Finally, near midnight, Dr. Adams appeared, still in surgical scrubs, his expression cautiously optimistic. We've stabilized her, he reported. The procedure was successful, but the next 24 hours will be critical. She's being moved to the intensive care unit now. Relief made Sophie's knees weak. Can I see her? Briefly, she's still unconscious from the anesthesia. Robert stood as Sophie prepared to follow the doctor. I'll wait here. Sophie hesitated, then made a decision that surprised them both. Come with me, please. Something shifted in Robert's expression, a softening around his eyes. Of course. Margaret Parker lay surrounded by machines monitoring every aspect of her fragile system, her small form nearly lost among tubes and wires. Sophie approached the bedside, gently taking her grandmother's hand. She's so small, Sophie whispered. I never think of her as small. She's always been the strongest person I know. Robert stood at the foot of the bed, observing the woman who had raised his daughter. Margaret's face, even in unconsciousness, carried the dignified lines of a life fully lived, joys and sorrows etched into each crease and fold. Thank you, he said quietly. Sophie looked up in surprise. For what? For being there when I wasn't. For raising the remarkable young woman standing beside me. His voice was low and sincere. For giving my daughter what I couldn't. The simple acknowledgement of Margaret's role in shaping Sophie's life broke something open between them. A recognition of the complex web of circumstances that had brought them to this moment. A nurse appeared to inform them that visiting time was over. Sophie bent to kiss her grandmother's forehead before reluctantly stepping away from the bed. In the corridor outside, Sophie turned to Robert. I should stay nearby tonight, in case there are any changes. There's a hotel across the street, Robert suggested. You could get a few hours rest and still be close. Sophie shook her head. I can't leave the hospital. Then I'll arrange for a cot in the private waiting room, Robert said, already pulling out his phone. And I'll stay too. You don't have to do that. I know. The simple response echoed his earlier declaration, offered without expectation or demand. Through connections, only a hospital board member could leverage. Robert arranged for Sophie to have access to a small private waiting area, normally reserved for staff. A comfortable reclining chair was provided for her, along with blankets and pillows. What about you? Sophie asked as she settled into the makeshift bed. I'll be fine in the regular waiting room, Robert assured her. Try to get some sleep. I'll wake you if there's any news. Exhaustion soon overcame Sophie's intention to merely rest her eyes. She fell into a deep sleep, her body surrendering to the emotional and physical toll of the past days. She awoke hours later to sunlight filtering through blinds and the smell of fresh coffee. Robert sat in a chair across from her, his suit jacket draped over the back, his tie loosened, scrolling through emails on his phone. What time is it? Sophie asked groggily. Robert looked up. Just after 7. There's coffee and bagels on the table. Dr. Adams came by 30 minutes ago. Your grandmother had a stable night. He's cautiously optimistic. Sophie sat up, combing fingers through her tangled hair. You stayed all night. It wasn't a question, but Robert answered anyway. Yes. Why? Robert set down his phone, giving Sophie his full attention. Because 22 years ago, I wasn't there when someone I loved needed me. I won't make that mistake again. The simple honesty of the statement hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor plea, simply truth. Sophie was saved from having to formulate a response by a knock at the door. A nurse entered to inform them that Margaret was awake and asking for her granddaughter. In the ICU, Margaret looked pale but alert, her keen eyes taking in Sophie's rumpled appearance and then sliding past her to where Robert stood hesitantly in the doorway. So you finally found each other, Margaret said, her voice weak but determined. Sophie moved to her grandmother's bedside. You should be resting, not worrying about me. Worrying about you is my full-time occupation, Margaret replied with a ghost of her usual spirit. Has been since the day you were born. Her gaze shifted to Robert. You might as well come in, Mr. Blackwood. Hovering in doorways doesn't suit a man of your stature. Robert stepped into the room, approaching the bed with unexpected deference. Mrs. Parker, I'm glad to see you're recovering. Don't waste pleasantries on me, Margaret said. I'm too old and too ill for social niceties. You're Sophie's father. The question is, what kind of father do you intend to be now? Grandma, Sophie protested, this isn't the time for interrogations. When you're my age, dear, every conversation might be your last. That tends to clarify one's priorities. Margaret fixed Robert with a penetrating stare. Well, Mr. Blackwood, Robert met her gaze directly. I intend to be whatever kind of father Sophie will allow me to be. I've missed 22 years. I have no expectations, only hope. Margaret studied him thoughtfully. Catherine said you were always good with words. The question is whether your actions will match them. They will, Robert said with quiet conviction. I've spent a lifetime building a company, accumulating wealth and power only to discover it means nothing without family to share it with. Pretty sentiment, Margaret observed. Catherine believed that about you once, that beneath the ambition beat the heart of a good man. Her gaze softened slightly. She never stopped believing it even after she left. Robert's composure faltered at this revelation. She never told me about Sophie. If she had, would it have changed anything? Margaret challenged. The man you were then, would he have chosen fatherhood over empire building? The question struck Robert like a physical blow. I don't know, he admitted after a long moment. I'd like to think so, but honesty compels me to admit I don't know. The candor of his response seemed to satisfy Margaret. She nodded slightly, then turned her attention back to Sophie. You look exhausted, dear. Have you been here all night? Yes, but I'm fine, Sophie assured her. Robert arranged for me to have a comfortable place to sleep. Margaret's eyebrows rose at Sophie's use of his first name, a small but significant shift. Did he not? Well, perhaps there's hope for you yet, Mr. Blackwood. A nurse entered to check Margaret's vital signs, using the interruption to remind them that visits should be kept brief. Sophie promised to return later, bending to kiss her grandmother's cheek. As they prepared to leave, Margaret called out, Robert. He turned surprised at the direct address. Catherine would have wanted you to know her, Margaret said simply. Whatever else happened between you, she would have wanted that. Robert nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in his throat. In the hospital corridor, Sophie turned to Robert. I need to go home, shower, change clothes. Will you let me know if there's any change in her condition? Of course. Robert hesitated, then added, I have a call with the Blackwood Foundation board at noon. A formality regarding funding allocations. Would you mind if I step out for an hour to take it? Sophie looked surprised at being consulted. No, of course not. You've already done more than enough staying all night. I'll have my driver take you home and bring you back whenever you're ready, Robert offered. Sophie shook her head. The subway's fine. Sophie, Robert's voice softened. Please, let me do this small thing. Something in his tone, a note of almost paternal concern, made Sophie relent. All right, thank you. As the sleek Mercedes carried her through morning traffic to the Bronx apartment, Sophie found herself reflecting on the events of the past 24 hours. Robert's unwavering presence at the hospital, his respectful interactions with Margaret, the vulnerability he had displayed in their conversations. The man she was coming to know seemed at odds with both the cold executive from the Crystal Room and the ruthless business titan portrayed in media profiles. Which was the real Robert Blackwood? Or were they all facets of a complex human being shaped by choices, circumstances, and the passage of time? At her apartment, Sophie showered and changed the hot water, washing away hospital grime, but doing little to clarify her tangled thoughts. She was gathering clean clothes for her return to the hospital when her phone rang an unknown number. Sophie Parker. The voice was female, professionally pleasant. Yes, who's calling? Jennifer Hayes, Mr. Blackwood's executive assistant. Mr. Blackwood asked me to inform you that he's arranged for your grandmother to be transferred to the private cardiac unit at New York Presbyterian as soon as she's stable for transport. Dr. Adams will continue to oversee her care along with the head of cardiac surgery at Presbyterian. Sophie sat heavily on the edge of her bed. He can do that. Mr. Blackwood sits on the boards of both hospitals, Hayes explained. The cardiac unit at Presbyterian is the finest in the country. Mrs. Parker will receive the best possible care. I didn't agree to this, Sophie protested. Mr. Blackwood anticipated you might have concerns, Hayes replied smoothly. He asked me to assure you that this is not an attempt to override your decisions regarding your grandmother's care. It's simply providing access to resources that would otherwise be unavailable. Dr. Adams agrees this is the best course of action for Mrs. Parker's recovery. Sophie was silent processing this information. Part of her bristled at decisions being made without her input, while another part recognized the practical benefits for Margaret. There's one more thing, Hayes continued. The driver will bring you to the Blackwood Foundation offices when you're ready. Mr. Blackwood would like to discuss something with you before you return to the hospital. What is it? Sophie asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. I believe it concerns a proposal regarding your grandmother's ongoing care and your own professional development, Hayes said. But Mr. Blackwood prefers to discuss it in person. Sophie's suspicion deepened. Was this Robert's way of buying her cooperation? Using Margaret's medical crisis to create obligation? Tell Mr. Blackwood I'll be there in an hour, Sophie said coolly, and that I look forward to hearing his proposal. The Blackwood Foundation occupied 3 floors of a sleek glass tower in Midtown, its entrance marked by a discreet plaque rather than ostentatious signage. Sophie was escorted by security directly to the top floor, where Jennifer Hayes waited to greet her. Hayes was exactly as Sophie had imagined, from her voice perfectly groomed, efficiently professional, with an air of contained competence. Miss Parker, thank you for coming. Mr. Blackwood is concluding his board call and will be with you shortly. May I offer you coffee or water while you wait? Sophie declined refreshments, instead asking to see the Foundation's gallery space, which Hayes had mentioned during their brief walk to the executive suite. The assistant led her to a large open area where the Foundation displayed artwork from programs it supported. The Blackwood Foundation funds arts education in underserved communities throughout the city, Hayes explained as they walked among the displayed works. These pieces are created by students in our programs. Sophie studied the artwork, impressed by both the quality and the diversity of expression. Paintings, sculptures, mixed media installations, all vibrant with the energy of young artists discovering their voices. This program was Mr. Blackwood's personal initiative, Hayes added. He reviews every grant application himself. Sophie turned in surprise. Really, I wouldn't have expected him to take such a hands-on approach. Hayes's professional demeanor softened slightly. There's a great deal about Mr. Blackwood that would surprise you, I think. He's been my employer for 15 years, and he still occasionally manages to surprise me. Before Sophie could question her further, Robert appeared at the gallery entrance. He had changed into a fresh suit but looked weary around the eyes, the only visible sign of his overnight hospital vigil. Sophie, thank you for coming. I see Jennifer has shown you our gallery. He approached, his manner cautiously friendly. What do you think? It's impressive, Sophie admitted. The quality of work is exceptional. Raw talent will flourish given opportunity and guidance. Robert said, genuine passion evident in his voice. That's the philosophy behind our arts programs. Hayes discreetly excused herself, leaving them alone among the artwork. Your assistant mentioned you wanted to discuss my grandmother's care, Sophie said, getting directly to the point. Robert nodded, gesturing toward a seating area at one end of the gallery. Yes, but not only that, please sit. Sophie took a seat, maintaining a formal posture that reflected her guarded emotional state. First, regarding Margaret's transfer to Presbyterian, Robert began. I want to be clear that this isn't an attempt to usurp your authority as her guardian. The cardiac unit there truly is exceptional, and given the complexity of her condition, she deserves the best care available. Which just happens to be at a hospital where you have influence, Sophie observed. Robert acknowledged the point with a slight nod. My connections provide access. I won't apologize for using them to help your grandmother. And what do you want in return? Sophie asked bluntly. Pain flashed across Robert's features. Nothing. This isn't a transaction, Sophie. There are no strings attached. In my experience, there are always strings. Robert sighed, rubbing his forehead wearily. A reasonable assumption given how we met. But in this case, you're mistaken. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. I've missed 22 years of your life. Nothing I can do will recover that time. But I can ensure your grandmother receives the best possible care. I can remove the financial burden that's been limiting your options. Not as payment for your acceptance or affection, but because it's what a father should do for his daughter. The simple directness of his statement undermined Sophie's defenses. She had prepared for manipulation or control, not for straightforward paternal concern. There's something else I'd like to discuss, Robert continued when Sophie remained silent. A proposal, but not the kind you're expecting. He reached for a folder on the table between them, opening it to reveal documents bearing the Blackwood Foundation letterhead. Every year, the foundation establishes a scholarship fund for promising artists from backgrounds with limited resources. This year, I'd like to name it the Catherine Parker Memorial Scholarship. Sophie's breath caught. What? A full scholarship to the New York Academy of Fine Arts, plus a stipend for living expenses and materials. Awarded annually to a student demonstrating exceptional artistic talent and financial need. Robert pushed the folder toward her. I'd like you to help design the selection criteria and sit on the committee that chooses the recipients. Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes. You want to create a scholarship in Mom's name. Catherine valued education and art above all else, Robert said softly. This seems an appropriate way to honor her memory. Sophie paged through the proposal momentarily speechless. This wasn't what she had expected at all. There's one more thing. Robert hesitated suddenly, seeming uncertain. The first scholarship would be awarded this year. He withdrew another document from the folder, sliding it across the table. Sophie scanned it, her eyes widening as she realized what she was reading. You want me to be the first recipient? The committee would make that decision, Robert clarified. Your application would be evaluated on its merits just like any other. But yes, I hope you would apply. Why? Sophie asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Why not just offer to pay for my education directly? Because I respect your independence too much to make you feel obligated to me personally, Robert explained. The foundation scholarship comes with no strings, no expectations beyond academic performance. You would earn it through your talent, not receive it as a gesture of paternal guilt. The thoughtfulness behind the arrangement touched Sophie deeply. Robert had found a way to offer support that preserved her dignity and independence, a consideration she wouldn't have expected from the man who had first treated her with such dismissive contempt. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to say anything now, Robert assured her. Think about it. Discuss it with Margaret when she's stronger. Whatever you decide, the Catherine Parker Memorial Scholarship will be established regardless. Sophie closed the folder, gathering her composure. Thank you for thinking of this, for honoring Mom this way. Robert smiled, a genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his face. It's the least I can do for the woman who gave me the greatest gift of my life, even if I didn't know it until now. The sentiment expressed with unvarnished sincerity created a moment of connection between them more powerful than any since their reunion. Robert's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He checked it quickly, then looked up. That's Dr. Adams. Your grandmother is awake and doing well. We should get back to the hospital. The drive back to Mount Sinai passed in contemplative silence, both Robert and Sophie absorbed in their own thoughts. The scholarship proposal had shifted something between them, moving their tentative relationship from the realm of obligation and history into a possible future of shared purpose. At the hospital, they found Margaret noticeably stronger, some color returned to her cheeks. She greeted them with a sharp gaze that missed nothing. You two look different, she observed. Something's changed. Sophie smiled, taking her grandmother's hand. We've been discussing a scholarship in Mom's name at the New York Academy of Fine Arts. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Catherine would have loved that. That's what I thought, Robert said quietly. It seemed the right way to honor her legacy. And what about your legacy, Mr. Blackwood? Margaret asked, her direct manner unchanged by her medical ordeal. What mark do you intend to leave? Robert considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. For most of my life, I assumed my legacy would be Blackwood Enterprises. The company, the innovations, the wealth created. Now I'm not so sure. And what changed your mind? Margaret pressed. Robert's gaze shifted to Sophie. Meeting my daughter, realizing that the most significant thing I've contributed to this world had nothing to do with technology or business success. The admission spoken plainly before them both hung in the air like a declaration. Sophie felt something shift within her, a loosening of the protective barrier she had maintained around her heart. Their moment of connection was interrupted by a nurse entering to check Margaret's vital signs. When she'd completed her task and left, Margaret fixed Robert with her penetrating gaze once more. "Sophie tells me you're arranging a transfer to Presbyterian." "Yes, if you're comfortable with that," Robert confirmed. "Their cardiac rehabilitation program is exceptional." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Seems you've thought of everything." "Hardly," Robert admitted, "but I'm trying to make myself useful in the ways I can." "And what happens when I'm recovered?" Margaret asked bluntly. "What kind of relationship do you envision with my granddaughter then?" "Grandma," Sophie protested, embarrassed by the direct questioning. "It's a fair question," Robert said. He took a moment to organize his thoughts before continuing. "I envision whatever relationship Sophie is comfortable with. I've missed 22 years. I have no right to demand anything, no expectations of instant connection. All I ask is the opportunity to know my daughter and for her to know me if she wishes." Margaret studied him, seeming to search for insincerity or manipulation in his expression. Finding none, she gave a small nod of approval. "Catherine always said you had a good heart beneath that corporate armor," she said finally. "I'm starting to see what she meant." The weeks that followed established a cautious new normal. Margaret's transfer to Presbyterian proceeded smoothly, and her recovery exceeded the doctor's expectations. Sophie divided her time between the hospital, her classes at the Community Arts Center, and reduced shifts at the Crystal Room, where Michael Thompson had generously adjusted her schedule to accommodate her grandmother's medical situation. Robert maintained a consistent but unobtrusive presence, visiting Margaret regularly, arranging for specialists when needed, but always deferring to Sophie's decisions regarding her grandmother's care. He never mentioned the scholarship again, leaving Sophie space to consider the proposal without pressure. Their interactions gradually evolved from awkward to cordial to something approaching comfortable. They discovered shared interests beyond art. Robert's unexpected knowledge of architectural history, Sophie's passion for classical music, mutual admiration for certain authors. A month after Margaret's surgery, Sophie received an unexpected call from Professor Diana Wilson at the Community Arts Center. "Sophie, wonderful news. The New York Academy of Fine Arts is offering 5 full scholarships to exceptional students from community programs. I've submitted your portfolio for consideration." Sophie's mind immediately went to Robert. Had he arranged this despite her indecision about the Blackwood Foundation scholarship? "When was this announced?" she asked carefully. "Just yesterday. It's a new program funded by an anonymous donor, completely merit-based." Wilson's voice was bubbling with excitement. "Final selections will be made after in-person interviews next month, but with your talent, I'd be shocked if you weren't chosen." After thanking her professor and ending the call, Sophie immediately contacted Robert. "Did you do this?" she asked without preamble when he answered. "The anonymous scholarships at the Academy." "Do what?" Robert sounded genuinely confused. "What scholarships?" Sophie explained what Professor Wilson had told her. When she finished, Robert was silent for a moment. "It wasn't me," he said finally, "though I wish I'd thought of it. Sounds like an excellent program." "You're sure you didn't arrange this as a way around my hesitation about the Blackwood scholarship?" "Sophie, I gave you my word that I would respect your independence." Robert said, a note of hurt evident in his voice. "I meant it." Sophie immediately regretted her accusation. "I'm sorry, that was unfair." "It's all right," Robert assured her. "Trust takes time to build, especially given how we met." His understanding, offered without resentment, made Sophie feel both relieved and slightly ashamed of her suspicion. "Professor Wilson thinks I have a good chance," she said, changing the subject slightly. "Of course you do," Robert replied, pride evident in his tone. "Your talent is exceptional. Any selection committee with functioning eyes would recognize that." The simple confidence in her abilities, expressed without qualification or condescension, warmed Sophie unexpectedly. It was the first time in their developing relationship that Robert had sounded purely paternal, offering the kind of unconditional belief that parents normally provide throughout a child's development. "Thank you," she said softly. 2 days later, Sophie arrived at the hospital to find Margaret sitting up in a chair, Muller, in her cheeks, engaged in animated conversation with Robert. They fell silent as she entered, exchanging looks that immediately raised Sophie's suspicion. "What are you two plotting?" she asked, setting down her bag. Margaret smiled innocently. "Just getting to know your father better. He's been telling me about the early days with your mother." "All good things, I hope," Sophie said, kissing her grandmother's cheek. "Catherine was the moral compass of our company," Robert said. She kept us honest when success and growth might have tempted us toward ethical shortcuts. That sounds like Mom, Sophie agreed, settling into a chair. She always said integrity wasn't something you could compromise just this once without losing it entirely. Wise woman, Robert murmured. The doctors say I can go home next week, Margaret announced. But apparently our apartment building isn't ideal for cardiac recovery. Too many stairs. Sophie frowned. They mentioned that. I've been looking at ground floor options, but everything in our price range is pretty far from your medical appointments. Margaret and Robert exchanged another meaningful look. What? Sophie asked, glancing between them. What are you not telling me? I may have a solution, Robert said carefully. If you're open to it. Sophie's guard immediately rose. What kind of solution? I own a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, Robert explained. Garden apartment on the ground floor, currently vacant. 2 bedrooms, private entrance, small patio garden. Walking distance to the promenade and convenient to Margaret's cardiac rehabilitation appointments. You're offering us your property, Sophie said flatly. I'm offering you the use of an appropriate living space during Margaret's recovery, Robert corrected gently. Not as a gift, but as a practical solution to a medical requirement. Sophie looked to her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. It's a sensible option, Sophie, and I'd feel better knowing you didn't have to travel so far to your classes and work. The building has security, Robert added, and it's a 15-minute subway ride to the academy should you receive that scholarship. Sophie felt cornered, though she recognized the practicality of the arrangement. Rent, she asked finally. Whatever you're currently paying, Robert suggested. Paid to the Blackwood Foundation's housing initiative if that makes you more comfortable. Not to me personally. Again, he had found a way to offer assistance while preserving her independence and dignity. Sophie was beginning to recognize this thoughtful consideration as a core aspect of Robert's character, one at odds with his public reputation as a ruthless businessman. I'd need to see it first, she said, her resistance softening. Of course, whenever you're ready. Margaret smiled, satisfaction evident in her expression. Well, that's settled then. Now, Robert was about to tell me about the time Catherine saved your first major contract with her quick thinking. The conversation shifted to stories of Catherine in the early days of Blackwood Technologies. Robert sharing memories that painted a picture of the vibrant, principled woman who had captured his heart long ago. Sophie listened, absorbing these glimpses of her mother as a young professional, sides of Catherine she had never known. In those stories, she began to see not just her mother and the father she was coming to know, but also reflections of herself, elements of both parents that had combined to shape her own character and talents. The brownstone in Brooklyn Heights exceeded Sophie's expectations. The garden apartment was spacious and bright, recently renovated with tasteful simplicity. The small private patio, though dormant in the late autumn chill, promised a green sanctuary in spring. It's perfect for grandmother's recovery, Sophie admitted, as Robert concluded their tour. Close to her doctors, no stairs, plenty of natural light. The building has a service elevator if the front steps prove challenging, Robert added. And the neighborhood is quiet but convenient. Sophie moved to the living room window, looking out at the tree-lined street. Why do you have this place? It doesn't seem like your style. Robert joined her at the window, maintaining a respectful distance. I bought it years ago as an investment property, but I kept it out of the rental market after the renovation. Wasn't sure why at the time. He paused. Now I think perhaps I was waiting for the right tenants. The comment could have sounded calculated, but Sophie heard only sincerity in his tone. She turned to face him, making her decision. We'll take it. Temporarily during grandmother's recovery, she clarified, and I insist on paying fair market rent. A percentage of your current rent? Robert countered. You're still working reduced hours to accommodate hospital visits. Sophie considered, then nodded. Agreed, and thank you. You're welcome. Robert hesitated, then added, Sophie, I know this is all happening very quickly. Meeting, discovering our connection. Now this. If at any point you need space or feel overwhelmed, please say so. I've waited 22 years. I can be patient. The consideration in this offer, the willingness to proceed at her pace rather than his, confirmed what Sophie was beginning to understand. The real Robert Blackwood was neither the cold executive from their first encounter, nor the ruthless titan portrayed in business profiles, but a complex man capable of both calculated severity and profound tenderness. I appreciate that, she said. This is all still strange for me, having a father after all this time. For me as well, Robert admitted. Being a father is not a role I ever expected to fill. I'm learning as I go. The humble acknowledgement of his own uncertainty made Sophie smile. I guess we're both figuring it out together then. I'd like that, Robert said softly. 3 months later, on a crisp spring morning, Sophie stood in the community center gallery, surrounded by her artwork. Her first solo exhibition, small but significant, showcased 12 portraits, including the centerpiece, a dual portrait of Robert and Catherine, in their youth recreated from the Locket photographs and Sophie's own artistic interpretation. Margaret, fully recovered and radiant with pride, moved among the attendees in her wheelchair, accepting congratulations on her granddaughter's talent. Professor Wilson guided potential patrons through the exhibition, explaining techniques and themes. Robert stood quietly at the back of the gallery, observing rather than intruding, allowing Sophie her moment of artistic recognition. He had provided no financial support for the exhibition beyond purchasing the first painting, a portrait of Margaret that now hung in his office. Sophie made her way through the crowd to where he stood. "You're lurking," she teased. "You're allowed to participate, you know. You're in half the paintings." Robert smiled. "This is your achievement. I didn't want to overshadow it." The mighty Robert Blackwood, concerned about stealing someone else's spotlight. Sophie raised an eyebrow. The business world would be shocked. "The business world knows only one version of me," Robert replied. "You're getting to know another." "Yes, I am," Sophie agreed softly. Their relationship had developed gradually over the past months, building through small moments rather than grand gestures. Coffee after Margaret's therapy sessions, occasional shared meals, conversations about art, literature, and increasingly their lives. Not yet comfortable enough to be called close, but progressing steadily toward genuine connection. Sophie had accepted the anonymous scholarship to the academy, beginning classes the previous month. Her talent had been immediately recognized by instructors and fellow students alike. The future she had once thought impossible now stretched before her, full of possibility. "I have something for you," Robert said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small wrapped package. "A graduation gift of sorts for completing your first exhibition." Sophie unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound sketchbook of exceptional quality, the cover embossed with her initials. Inside the front cover, Robert had written a simple inscription: "To Sophie, for the next chapter of your story, with pride, Robert." The simplicity of the gift, thoughtful rather than extravagant, perfectly captured their evolving relationship. Not trying to buy affection with grand gestures, but offering genuine support for her passion. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched. "It's perfect. Your mother would be so proud of you today," Robert said quietly. "Not just of your talent, but of who you've become. Your integrity, your determination." Sophie felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I think she'd be proud of both of us," she said, "of how far we've come." From across the room, Margaret caught their exchange and smiled, satisfaction evident in her expression. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges as they continued to build this unexpected relationship, but the foundation was solid, constructed of shared values, mutual respect, and the enduring connection of the woman they had both loved. Sophie looked around the gallery at her work displayed on the walls, at her grandmother's beaming face, at the father she was slowly coming to know. The broken pieces of her history were gradually finding new arrangement, not erasing the fractures of the past, but creating something whole and meaningful from them, a mosaic more complex and beautiful than the original could ever have been.